Friends, will you pray with me? May the words of my mouth and the meditations of all of our hearts be acceptable unto you, O God, our rock and our Redeemer. On Good Friday, just a couple days before his own death, Pope Francis said this: "Today's builders of Babel tell us that there is no room for losers, and those who fall along the way are losers. Theirs is the construction site of hell." Our first reading today comes from Genesis, early in the story of humanity, not long after Adam and Eve have unceremoniously left the Garden of Eden, not long before things fall even more apart at Babel. We get a question. What? Am I my brother's keeper? Cain asked God, as if he really thinks the answer is no, as if he really expects God doesn't know that he has murdered his brother. Cain killed Abel because he was angry. He was angry because when Abel, a shepherd, gave God an offering, God regarded it, paid attention to it, looked kindly on it. Cain, a farmer, had given God an offering too, and God didn't pay that much attention to it. At least not at that moment, on that day. We don't hear that God cursed Cain's offering or rejected it or punished him anyway, just that he regarded Abel's offering and didn't particularly regard Cain's. In the moment of blessing from God, Cain doesn't support Abel, his brother, or find joy in this, or seek to know what would please God more. Cain believes in winners and losers. If Abel is a winner, Cain must be a loser, and Cain cannot handle being a loser. So he murders Abel, and then claims he had no responsibility for his brother's well-being in the first place. Am I my brother's keeper? Am I my sister's keeper? Am I my sibling's keeper? My neighbor's keeper? What do we owe to one another? What are our obligations to our siblings, our neighbors, our fellow humans? I've been thinking a lot about empathy, about empathy lately, as the effort by evangelical fascists to convince us not to be empathetic continues. They want to convince us that empathy is a sin, a weakness. Maybe empathy is for losers. This is obviously both heresy and nonsense, but it has been a part of the white supremacist Christian nationalist agenda for quite some time to claim that cruelty and domination are both part of nature and correspondingly part of God's plan for humanity. They want the worst things about humans to be held up as what makes us great. One definition of sin is that which separates us from God, right? But how could creating more distance, more alienation between humans, each of us made in the divine image, how could that distance bring us closer to God? Is it God's plan for us to all be hopelessly alone for all eternity? I don't believe that. I don't believe you believe that either. Yet we are in a moment where there are powerful voices at work who want us to learn not to see one another. In everything from outright violence to more subtle rhetorical moves, the strategies for dehumanizing and scapegoating vulnerable people are all around us. We are encouraged to see people who are vulnerable or weak or targeted by oppression as a little less human. But all of these voices, they also want to convince each of us, no matter how much privilege or vulnerability we hold, they want to convince each of us to be a little less human too, a little less emotional, a little less compassionate, a little more selfish, a little bit more competitive. What's worrisome is that under a great amount of stress, some of this seems to be creeping out and getting into even some of the kinder parts of society. It's understandable. People are stressed and people seem impatient and people are scared and hoping to protect themselves. And so people give in a little bit to the idea that demanding justice is maybe asking for too much, or that you can demand justice but not like that. There's the idea that a person's only worth is the productive work they can do under capitalism. The idea that vulnerable people who suffer and die from violence and scarcity were maybe at least a little bit at fault. The idea that saving democracy means leaving some people behind, that we can't ask for too much, so we have to, in this logic, compromise on the humanity of immigrants, or the humanity of trans people, or neurodivergent people, or disabled people, or the list goes on, right? And there is no room for compromise in who counts as human, because we are, all of us, each other's keepers. In John's gospel, as many commentators have pointed out, as fits within our Lenten theme, the whole story of Jesus' arrest and passion and burial and resurrection, it all happens in a garden, which makes the resurrection something of a creation story. Over the centuries, Christians have talked about the garden in John's Gospels as a new Eden, a place where creation is reborn as Jesus as risen. And so we see the creation story and the resurrection story in conversation, mirroring each other in the literary language of Scripture. And so this week, as we move a week ahead in John's Gospel, we also move to the next story of Genesis. What happens if we let those stories, Cain and Abel and Thomas and Jesus, talk to each other, mirror each other? Adam and Eve, far from the garden, have two sons, Cain and Abel. We know how that goes. I'm not particularly prone to using language of original sin, but I think that if there is an original sin in Genesis, it's this one. And then Jesus, raised from the dead, who has appeared to Mary Magdalene and then to many other disciples later that evening, except Thomas wasn't there, he missed out. So he wants what his friends had, what the other disciples had. He wants to see Jesus. And so a week later, Jesus appears to Thomas. Thomas, probably is known as Doubting Thomas. And while I think doubt is an incredibly important part of our faith, I don't actually think this is a story about doubt in the traditional sense. I think this is a story about relationship. The people in Jesus' life, his family, his friends, his disciples, both named and unnamed, the whole community surrounding them. The gospel tells their story too. One of the particular gifts John's gospel gives us is a specific focus, a specific emphasis on the really caring, human, intimate relationships Jesus has with his disciples, his family, his community. We see Mary pouring perfume on Jesus' feet, and we see Mary, the mother of Jesus and the disciple whom Jesus loved, taking each other on as family at the foot of the cross. And on the day of Jesus' resurrection, we see the grief and the humanity and the individual relationships showing forth in the way Mary Magdalene and Simon Peter and the others react to Jesus coming back. He's not just their teacher. These are human relationships. John shows us how this chosen family of sorts throughout Jesus' life and ministry and death is formed and transformed by the presence of the Word made really human flesh. And so when we come to Thomas, who has said, okay, unless I see him and see all of his wounds from the crucifixion, unless I can touch him and know that he is real, I'm not buying it. Thomas, like all the others, is grief-struck and traumatized and surrounded by violence, and he wants another moment with Jesus. This is not just a story about a restoration of belief in some intellectual sense. This is a story about the restoration of a relationship that was broken by violent death and grief. Thomas doesn't need to understand that Jesus is alive. He just wants to see his friend. And so on the first day of the week, Jesus appears to Thomas. In an instant, he recognizes Jesus both as the human friend he has mourned and the God of all creation. At this point, John doesn't even tell us whether Thomas needed to grab his hand after all. Jesus appears and reappears here in a way that's not quite natural, not quite human. He's passing through doors, apparently. He's not so much coming and going as just sometimes he's there and sometimes he's not. But the wounds from his crucifixion are still there. There's no idea that he has to be magically healed to be alive again. If Jesus dying and rising in a garden somehow mirrors the loss of paradise and invites us into new creation, could his reunion with the disciples be the mirror story that helps us undo the curse of Cain and Abel? Does encountering the risen Christ, does that change us so much that the alienation from, not just from God, but from one another, can fall away entirely? In Jesus, we are liberated from all that separates us from God and from one another. we are free to live in a new creation of beloved community. That is the experience of Easter, not the idea of it, but the relationship of it, makes us better at being humans. I'm using we in a couple different ways here, we as Christians and we as humans, and I want to tease those apart because I know that they're not the same thing. I want to be mindful of this in particular because of the way John's gospel uses this phrase for the fear of the Jews that has been used in a lot of harmful ways throughout history. And I don't believe we're to read that as some blanket anti-Semitic condemnation so much as speaking more to the fear of this community, of the surrounding community. But in writing it that way, rather than being clear about the Roman source of violence, we can fall into that rhetorical trap that can lead to a lot of nasty places. The recreation we find in Jesus and his resurrection is no excuse to alienate ourselves from humans who don't share our faith. We are siblings, neighbors, kin to all people. Our Christian siblings, yes, but people of every faith and no faith too. And we can recognize how our own faith shapes our understanding of what those relationships mean, both near and far, without some need for coercion or proselytizing. In the resurrection, we are saved, made whole, made free, made new, even if our minds can't get around it. It's not a prize we earned. It's a gift that unfolds right in front of us like a flower in the spring sunshine. Something we behold, something that changes us, whether we understand it or doubt it or a little bit of both. We are each other's keepers after all, because God in Jesus keeps us. None of us as an individual is responsible for being everything to everybody, but we as humanity, we are made and remade to take care of one another. Am I my sibling's keeper? Am I my neighbor's keeper? Yes, even when it's really, really hard. And I, in turn, belong to all of those people who take care of me in ways I see and ways I don't see. We are all interdependent. That's what it is to be human. That's part of God's plan in creation and in recreation. This is, I believe, good news, even when things are very, very hard. When you are angry and heartbroken about what you see in the news, what you see in your neighborhood, what you maybe hear people say around you, find hope in that, because you have not given up your humanity, your decency, your softness, your conviction that we belong to one another, your conviction that we can still be made new into a beloved community. I want to end with a poem, and I want to give a little context. This is typically read as a love poem, but about a year or so ago, I heard the poet Saeed Jones read this E. Cummings poem on a podcast. And he, in that podcast conversation, situated it in light of James Baldwin's quote about how all children everywhere belong to all of us, as an expression of human connection, human care, human mutual belonging to children in Gaza, to students in encampments, indeed to everyone who is oppressed. And so I will end with this poem. I carry your heart with me. I carry it in my heart. I am never without it. Anywhere I go, you go, my dear. And whatever is done by only me is your doing, my darling. I fear no fate, for you are my fate, my sweet. I want no world, for beautiful you are, my world, my true. And it's you are, whatever a moon has always meant, and whatever a sun will always sing is you. Here is the deepest secret nobody knows. Here is the root of the root, and the bud of the bud, and the sky of a tree called life, which grows higher than soul can hope or mind can hide. And this is the wonder that's keeping the stars apart. I carry your heart. I carry it in my heart. Amen.